A warm welcome to all of you. This is Tom Stone. So, this is the Freedom Practice Training Lesson 1. This is designed for people who want to really grow at a very fast pace. And it's really for people who want the fast growth and are willing to do and ready to do what it takes to make that happen. Fortunately, it's not difficult. So, there are two sections to the training. Section 1 is about the overview of the training. And also in the second lesson, the first two lessons are part of this first section. The second lesson, there's going to be the opportunity to learn a powerful technique for resolving emotional pain and trauma. That's going to be the first section. And that technique is called the IN technique. So I'll be learning that in lesson 2. Most people get major breakthroughs from learning and using the IN technique. This makes the IN technique one of the most important things you will learn in your entire life. That's because emotions have both content and energy. But because we've grown up in a world that thinks that psychology is the way to handle emotional problems, most people think that the solution to problems is to understand the content. But we all know of people who've gone to traditional therapy for years and still have their problems. Like the example of Ernie, who's a Vietnam veteran who I met back quite some years ago, who had nightmares from PTSD as a result of the traumas that he had from being in the war. He was in the worst of it in Khe Sanh back in the 60s. When I met him, Ernie had been having nightmares every night for 43 years. He had been going for traditional therapy at the Veterans Administration for 17 years, but he still had his nightmares. That's after 17 years of cognitive therapy. Clearly, that wasn't working. Now, because of the nightmares, he was only sleeping about 2 to 3 hours a night, and he was tired all the time. But he came to see me, and in one session, we resolved the energy of the 5 traumas that were causing his nightmares. He called me the next day to report that he had slept 9 hours without a single nightmare for the first time in 43 years. So take your pick, 17 years with no result or one session and getting a problem solved. But does it last? Well, I saw Ernie on a different kind of event about a year and a half later, and I asked him how he was sleeping. He said that single one session since then, he hadn't had a single nightmare. The IN technique resolves all kinds of trauma. Using it, I helped Heather and many others to get rid of her nightmares in one session.
Hi, I'm Heather, and I came to Tom after experiencing some really intense, persistent nightmares after a traumatic event in my life where I was not sleeping, waking up throughout the night, waking up with horrifying nightmares that left me feeling anxious throughout the day to extreme levels. And I had one session with Tom. And after that one session, I haven't had a single nightmare since. It's been, I think, 2 months. And my anxiety levels went from like a 12 on a scale of 1 to 10 to a 0. And have stayed really, really low, only, barely minimal experience of anxiety has reoccurred since then. And it's been rather miraculous, actually, to have this kind of relief and freedom in my daily life and in my sleep. So I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you, Tom.
This is because the energy, not the content, it's the energy that gives life to a problem. And if you still have the energy of the problem, you still have the problem. With the IN technique, you learn how to thoroughly resolve the energy of unresolved disruptive emotional pain. Most people have no idea how to do this. That's because everyone learns to suppress and avoid any unresolved emotional pain when you're very young. You get so good at suppressing the energy and the sensation of the energy of your emotional pain that you don't even realize that you're doing that. When something emotionally painful happens, you get overwhelmed. You just can't process all the emotional pain right when it happens. It's just too much. And when you can't process it all in the moment, what happens is you archive it and it accumulates. The In technique teaches you how to resolve suppressed emotional pain better than anything you've ever tried before. You'll be amazed at how great it feels to have that old emotional pain finally out of your body. You haven't known how to do that, and it seems difficult or even impossible, but it turns out to be much, much easier than you'd think. You'll learn how to do the In technique in the next lesson. If you like what you learn in section 1, you'll also love section 2. As you'll see in a moment, there are 2 main techniques that you can learn from taking the full training in the freedom practice. They're called the pure awareness techniques. That's because at the end of each technique, you experience the expansive vastness of your own awareness. Here's a chart showing the 2 types of emotional energy patterns. One type of emotions are useful emotions. These are emotions that are energizing and empowering, things like love, compassion, happiness, joy. Even fear can be energizing and empowering. If you're about to step out into the street and one of these new Tesla electric cars is coming, you can't hear it because it's so quiet, you see it at the last minute, you kind of jump back, and that's actually a very positive use of fear. Fear we normally think of as a negative emotion, but it can actually be protecting us, saving us from harm. Now, the other main category of emotions is what are called not useful emotions. And these not useful emotions tend to be disruptive and depleting. And there are 2 categories of them. One of them is the painful internal emotions. And these are things like trauma, emotional pain, heartbreak, resentment, grief, the list goes on and on. And these have a tendency to be stored as localized, concentrated patterns of energy in the body when we can't complete the experience of it right when it happens. These are called In technique energies. The other category is called reactive emotions. And these are emotions that create upsets. When we have an expectation that doesn't get met, we tend to get angry, disappointed, frustrated, or sad. And the other subcategory of the reactive emotions are projecting the possibility of negative outcomes onto the future, which can produce fear, worry, fear, anxiety, panic attacks, and so forth. This kind of energy field from these emotions is completely different than the In technique energies. It has a tendency to be radiating out from the body, sort of surrounding and engulfing us. So we could say that with In technique energies, the energy is inside of us. But with the Out technique energies, we're inside of the energy field. So we have 2 kinds of energy, and this leads us to have 2 kinds of techniques, the In technique and the Out technique. So the In technique you're going to learn in this section, and the Out technique you'll learn in section 2. Section 2 of this training and several specific applications for using the pure awareness techniques can be purchased when you finish section 1. The special applications include using the pure awareness techniques to make it possible to do all kinds of things, to resolve things like anxiety, panic attacks, depression, anger, frustration, sadness, grief, trauma, heartbreak, nightmares, the fear of rejection, like when you're selling and you don't want to hear the word no and feel rejected, and the fear of public speaking. And these are all very common kinds of emotional problems that people have. fears and traumatic experiences. And so the beauty of the pure awareness techniques is that we can actually resolve all these kinds of problems fairly quickly and relatively easily. It's surprising how easy it is. So you'll be able to purchase the detailed guidelines for the specific applications individually or all of them together at a big discount. What we're really talking about is an important thing of making good decisions consistently. It turns out that there are 4 kinds of thoughts that are the primary kinds of thoughts that influence your decisions and your resulting actions. The 4 kinds of thoughts are, you can see on the left here, practical, intuitive, ego-based, and emotional pain-based. So what to do about them? The practical thoughts, you just, they don't have any emotional charge to them. So you just get a sense of the right timing and the right action to take, and then you do it when it's the right time. Intuitive thoughts, you recognize intuition, and then you take action if needed. Sometimes intuitive thoughts are just about things that are just going to happen without you doing anything. You're just going to step into a reality where they exist. The ego-based thoughts, you typically use the out technique, which we'll learn in section 2, and the emotional pain-based thoughts, you learn the in technique, which, as I mentioned, we're going to learn in the next lesson. What you're learning is how to do the freedom practice, the current extent to which the 4 kinds of thoughts are influencing your decisions, and that you do with what's called a personal decision influence assessment, or a DIA. And I'll show you about that in a few minutes. The 4 phases of the freedom practice, which I'll explain in detail, and 4 of the 8 pure awareness techniques. There are 8, but you're going to learn 4 in this training, the 4 most common ones. They're called quietness, locate, in, and out. And you're also going to learn muscle testing, how to do self-muscle testing. It's an absolutely wonderful technique. I learned it about 25 years ago. I've taught thousands of people how to do it. It's one of the best things I ever learned, and you'll find that'll be true for you as well. You'll also learn how to make freedom practice reports, which are just a short few sentences that you'll report on your experiences to a discussion group that we'll have. And this will give your mentor, or me, if I'm doing the mentoring, the opportunity to give you some feedback and mentoring if you have any questions, or if we sense that there's anything that you could be doing even better. Most people don't know how to handle their emotions very well. You learn to suppress and avoid your emotional pain in very early childhood. And you got so good at it that you do it automatically without even realizing that you're doing it. Now, how does the accumulated residual emotional pain affect you? It results in collecting 2 databases of unresolved disruptive emotional energies, one for the in technique energies and one for the out technique energies. One of these databases is the unresolved pain. Those will be mainly the in technique energies. They're a collection of your incomplete emotional experiences. The incomplete experiences of the emotional pain that you couldn't fully process when they happened, these are patterns of energy held in your body as localized, constricted feelings. Everyone has lots of these energies held in their body. And we refer to them as in-technique energies, and that's because the in-technique is what you'll be using to resolve them. The other database of unresolved emotions are called reactive emotions, as you could see on that types of emotions chart I showed. And we refer to these unresolved disruptive energy patterns as out technique energies because we use the out technique to resolve those. Everyone has lots of these reactive emotions as well, and you'll be learning how to resolve reactive emotions in section 2 of this training. You have thoughts that are caused by unresolved emotional pain. We call these emotional pain-based thoughts. And you have thoughts that are created by unresolved reactive emotions. We call these ego-based thoughts. In addition to your ego-based and emotional pain-based thoughts, you also have practical thoughts and intuitive thoughts. The practical thoughts and intuitive thoughts don't have any disruptive emotional energies at their basis. The ego-based and emotional pain-based thoughts do have disruptive emotional energies at their basis. You typically are not aware of the presence of these disruptive emotions because they're so deeply suppressed. In addition, you have been having all four kinds of thoughts all your life, so they're all very familiar to you. And you haven't known that it's possible to distinguish the useful ones from the not useful ones. Most importantly, you haven't known that there are a couple of simple techniques for easily and quickly finding and resolving the disruptive emotions at the basis of your ego and emotionally pain-based thoughts. Finding out how to locate and resolve these emotional pains is actually a phenomenal discovery. How is it that I know this and can say it with such confidence? It's because in 1993, I had a bizarre experience of getting shot in the chest by a deranged stranger right at my front door. And he used a .44 caliber handgun, which is a big gun. The bullets are enormous, and hunters use them for killing bears. So it's a complete miracle that this didn't kill me. So it hit me right in the chest. So as a result of this attack, I had 2 surgeries in order to get the bullet out. But I also had PTSD with all the symptoms: nightmares, flashbacks, startle response, hypervigilance, the works. And I didn't believe the psychological dogma that PTSD is incurable. I felt intuitively that they must be missing something. So I started to do my own private research to see if I could find a way to cure my PTSD. It took a while to find the answer I was looking for, but I was very fortunate to discover a simple insight that allowed me to completely cure my PTSD. All the PTSD symptoms disappeared within a few days, and I haven't had any PTSD symptoms for over 25 years. My insight was very simple. So simple, I can see why it got missed. Here it is. When we're very young, we all get emotionally overwhelmed lots and lots of times. Nobody likes it. In fact, we hate it. We rapidly learn to do everything we can to avoid getting emotionally overwhelmed. We learn to suppress and avoid emotional pain as much as possible. And this happens even before we learn how to speak. We get so good at suppressing emotional pain that we do it automatically without even being aware that we're doing it. The consequence of this is that we accumulate a database of unresolved emotional pain and continue to accumulate more and more of it throughout our life. When we have an emotionally painful experience, we often can't process all of the energy of the pain, so we archive it in our body. We hate having the feeling of that pain, so we put it off until later, hoping that maybe we won't ever have to feel it. But it doesn't get rid of it. It's still in there, waiting to be completed. It needs to be felt until it's really gone. This is the setup for becoming emotionally incompetent. And I would say this is so common and so prevalent that we live on a fundamentally emotionally incompetent planet. And you see that in the ego-based functioning of leaders of countries who impose war and other kinds of problems on people, either neighbors or their own country. And we see it in the various kinds of reactivity of anger, disappointment, resentments, all kinds of things that happen in relationships and between individuals, groups, and organizations. We don't realize that many of our thoughts are caused by unresolved painful energies of the suppressed emotions. When we want to change, we need to dedicate ourselves to making the desired change. But you also need to understand what's really going on and know what to do about it. We need the knowledge of how to make the change. The thing that causes it to be difficult to distinguish between useful and not useful thoughts requires more than just being told to notice and favor the useful thoughts. Most people just can't do that. The generating of negative thoughts is a deeply conditioned way of being. The conditioning is powerful. You can't change it just by deciding that you want to or that you're going to do it. The conditioning will always win. It's way too well entrenched. To be aware of the difference between useful and not useful thoughts, you have to make conscious something that has been unconscious. People are not conscious of this difference. This is because you've been having both useful and not useful thoughts your whole life. And the unresolved emotional energy at the basis of the not useful thoughts is so well suppressed that you don't even realize that it's there. It seems that all your thoughts are just normal. Is there a solution to this problem? Fortunately, there is. The ability to consistently determine if there is residual emotional energy at the root of a given thought is easy when using muscle testing. And you're going to learn how to make the unconscious conscious. You're going to learn how to use muscle testing in the section 2 of the training. Preparation for the training. The first thing we want to know is to what extent each category of these 4 different kinds of thoughts is influencing your decisions. And to do that, we use what we call a DIA, or a personal decision influences assessment. Here's an example of a DIA. You can see on the left, we have the decisions are influenced by far left column, the practical thoughts. The optimal practical thoughts is at, we could say 100%. Intuitive thoughts also ideally would be 100%. Ego-based thoughts, we want them to be 0 influence on our decisions. And emotional pain-based thoughts, we also want to be 0. So here's someone, I changed the name just to protect the innocent. And this is from back in 2018. This is a student who was taking the course and got their decision influence assessment. Their practical thoughts were pretty high, 88. They're often, for most people, up in the 90s. And intuitive thoughts are very often in the teens, interestingly enough. And that's because of the enormous presence of the ego-based thoughts and emotional pain-based thoughts, which you can see are 57 and 48. These are like noise in your system. These are like landmines in the swamp of your inner emotional landscape. And they're so noisy, if you will, they're so prevalent that they have a tendency to mask or cover up the intuitive thoughts. It's a little bit like having dark glasses on. So what we put our attention on in the freedom practice is we put our attention on the resolving the ego-based thoughts and the emotional pain-based thoughts. And as those numbers go down, the numbers for intuition and practical thoughts naturally just go up. We don't have to do anything to make them go up. They're actually already there. They're just sort of covered up by or masked by the ego and emotionally pain-based thoughts. So how it works, there are 4 phases to the freedom practice. The first phase is doing the freedom practice each day, typically first thing in the morning. The second phase happens spontaneously. After a few weeks of doing phase 1, you continue with phase 1, but you also start to integrate doing the freedom practice into your daily life. Phase 3 is called the Freedom Practice Mastery Program. And this helps you to not miss any opportunities to use the freedom practice techniques, pure awareness techniques, during that day. Phase 4 is called topic-specific freedom practice, and this means using the freedom practice to resolve unresolved disruptive emotional energies for specific topics like how do you have extraordinary relationships or extraordinary prosperity, extraordinary leadership, extraordinary parenting, etc. So here's each phase in some detail. The freedom practice is simple. You use the quietness technique to go into the background of silence that's behind your thoughts. And you just stay in the silence for 20 to 30 minutes or more. While you're in the silence, naturally you'll have thoughts, plenty of thoughts. When each thought comes, you muscle test, use the self-muscle test that you learn in section 2 to determine which of the 4 kinds of thoughts each one is. Then you test if it's optimal to do something about it or not. If it's an emotional pain-based thought, it'll usually test to be optimal to do the in technique for it. If it's an ego-based thought, you'll usually test that it's optimal to do the out technique for it. The in and out technique energies will vary in intensity. Some thoughts may have both in and out technique energies at their basis. Sometimes you'll be surprised at how much unresolved emotional energy there is. Normally, you don't recognize the basis of your thoughts. During the freedom practice, you'll start to recognize the kinds of thoughts you are having. By testing, you'll know what to do about them. You can muscle test when it's enough for that day. Phase 2. After doing phase 1 for a few weeks, you'll naturally start to do phase 2. You become conscious during your morning practice, you become conscious of your ego-based and emotionally pain-based thoughts. So you start to know what those are, and you start to be able to recognize them when they come up during the day. You'll also become more aware of when you're triggered emotionally by different circumstances that activate ego and emotionally pain-based thoughts. So this gives you an opportunity to recognize them, stop what you're doing right at that time, and do the pure awareness techniques to resolve them. So you'll be aware to test for which kind of thought each one is, and be able to then do the appropriate technique to resolve it. So if it's an ego and emotionally pain-based thought, you immediately use the locate technique to find where the energy is at the basis of that thought, where it is in and around the body. And then you'll do the appropriate pure awareness technique to resolve it. Sometimes there'll be more than one in or out technique energy. Sometimes there'll be both in and out technique energies. Resolve them all right then. You stop what you're doing, you find a way to be in a place where you can close your eyes and do the techniques, and you just go ahead and get it done right then. Phase 3, which is called the Freedom Practice Mastery Program, as you go through the day, you practice being aware of every ego and emotionally pain-based thought you have. Now, sometimes you may not always be able to resolve the energies right away. Every evening, you review your day and check to see if you missed any opportunities to use the pure awareness techniques during that day. You then send your numbers to your mentor, who double checks for you to make sure that you aren't missing anything. And once you have the accurate count, you use the techniques right away and resolve whatever you missed during the day. Phase 4 is called topic-specific freedom practice. And this means that freedom practice to resolve unresolved disruptive emotional energies for specific topics like extraordinary relationships, extraordinary prosperity, extraordinary leadership, extraordinary parenting, extraordinary coach training, etc. We also set up a discussion group for the class, and this is where you post your freedom practice reports. And it's where your mentor will give you guidance as needed. You'll also see everyone's freedom practice reports and get the guidance from the mentor to everyone, which is great because you'll get guidance about things that you may not have experienced yet. It's important to do this daily. So some point in the day, each day, you'll prepare a freedom practice report. This is typically at the end of the day. And it's a simple report of what you did during your freedom practice that day, whether it was in the morning when you were just doing your 20, 30 minutes by yourself, or whether it was when you were recognizing ego and emotionally pain-based thoughts that came up during the day. It can be quite short. Here's an example of doing a freedom practice report while you're just starting in phase 1. I tested for one of the thoughts. It was ego-based thought and needed the out technique energy, which I did, and resolved the energy. Then I had 2 thoughts that tested as being emotional pain-based and resolved them with locate and the in technique. So in phase 4, these are applications of how to resolve problems like anxiety, heartbreak, grief, and trauma. And you can start to use the freedom practice to resolve thoughts that are not likely to just come up just on their own during the day. These are special guidelines and instructions for applying the freedom practice techniques to different areas of your life where you'd like to improve your life. The programs in phase 4 help you to do that. And you'll get access to an index of such programs at the end of phase 2. At the end of phase 2, yeah. Phase 3 and 4 can be done simultaneously or like in parallel. Post your freedom practice report to the discussion group. An example of a phase 2 freedom practice report. I was in a meeting with some business colleagues and I noticed that their comments were quite ego-based. Then I noticed that I had a reaction of judging them for being that way. I tested that was my own ego-based thought and quietly did out technique even with my eyes open. After doing the out technique, I felt calm and present again with no emotional charge towards my colleagues. So the consequences of learning and doing the freedom practice is you'll start to become much more conscious of what kind of thoughts you're having and what to do about them. You'll become much more emotionally competent. You won't have to ever be the victim of your emotions ever again. And you'll start to experience more and more presence of pure awareness in your life. You will naturally access and express your inner greatness a lot more. Now, in lesson 2, you're going to learn the quietness technique, the locate technique, and the in technique. The quietness technique gives you immediate access to the experience of pure awareness, which is your essential nature. The locate technique shows you where specific unresolved energy patterns are being held in your body or around your body. It's kind of like a GPS system for finding the energy so that you can then use the appropriate pure awareness technique to resolve it. The in technique is for completing incomplete experiences of emotional pain and trauma. This is the technique I discovered that allowed me to completely get rid of my traumas that were creating all of my PTSD symptoms after I got shot. As I mentioned, I haven't had a PTSD symptom for over 25 years. The in technique is one of the most important things you will learn in your entire life. And remember, lesson 2 is also free. See you at lesson 2.